It's not like Paul is singing every song,
Right.
or Mick or whoever.
When Neil Aspinall died in 2008, the world expected the Beatles' inner circle to show up in full force. After all, Neil wasn't just a longtime executive. He was practically the fifth Beatle, a childhood friend who sat behind the wheel of their first touring van and later became the quiet architect behind Apple Corps. His funeral drew music royalty, emotional tributes, and people who owed a piece of their careers to him. But one face was unexpectedly missing: Ringo Starr. Fans immediately jumped to rumors, imagined feuds, and rewrote old dramas. But the real story, why Ringo refused to attend, is far more surprising than what people think it is. The childhood struggle you never knew. Ringo Starr's story starts with a twist that always surprises people. Depending on how you look at it, he was both the oldest and the youngest Beatle. He was the last one to officially join the band, stepping in after Pete Best, which technically made him the newcomer. But at the same time, he was the only one born before John, Paul, and George. Back then, he wasn't Ringo Starr at all. He was Richard Starkey, born on July 7, 1940, in Liverpool's Dingle district. His parents, Richard Starkey Sr. and Elsie Gleave, worked as confectioners, and he was their only child. Life in the Dingle wasn't easy. Poverty was everywhere, and the neighborhood had a reputation for crime and hard luck. His home was described later as cramped, crumbling, and practically straight out of a Dickens novel. Most of Ringo's childhood rested on the shoulders of his mother. His father abandoned the family when Ringo was just 3 years old, and even before that, he wasn't exactly the type to stay home and bond with his son. Because of this, Ringo grew up with almost no memories of him. His mother, trying her best to hold everything together, took on any job she could find and became fiercely protective of her only child. Growing up in the Dingle taught him a simple survival code: keep your head down, stay alert, and avoid trouble. And honestly, trouble found him anyway, not from the streets, but from his own body. At just 6 years old, he suffered a burst appendix that led to peritonitis. The situation got so bad that he slipped into a coma for several days. He survived, but recovery was long and painful. He spent 6 months in the hospital, and just when things were starting to look up, he fell out of his bed and ripped his stitches open. That accident tacked on another 6 months to his stay. By the time he got out, he was miles behind his classmates. And then, at 13, his health failed him again. This time it was tuberculosis, brought on by the rough industrial environment of his neighborhood. He was sent away to a sanitarium in the countryside, which, for a kid his age, was basically life on pause. The days there were quiet and slow. He and the other patients would pass time knitting dishcloths just to break the monotony. Then something new came along. A music teacher who showed up with drums, tambourines, triangles, and maracas. She used a giant sheet of paper with colored dots to guide them like a little rhythm orchestra. The first time Ringo was handed the drum, that was it. When she came back weeks later and tried to assign him another instrument, he simply refused. From that moment on, rhythm became his refuge. Still, life at the sanitarium was no party. They weren't even allowed to get out of bed most days. After 6 months, being permitted to sit in a chair felt like a milestone. The music wasn't therapy. It was survival. It was something to keep their minds alive while their bodies healed. Altogether, Ringo spent about 3 years of his childhood in hospitals or medical facilities. By the time he finally recovered from tuberculosis, he was so far behind in school that returning didn't seem worth it. He walked away from formal education altogether. At 15, he went straight into the working world, bouncing from one dead-end job to another. One of his earliest gigs was serving drinks as a waiter on a dayboat that ran between Liverpool and North Wales. But that didn't last long. With the Royal Navy still drafting men at the time, he panicked that working on a boat might make him a prime candidate for conscription. So he quit before they could call his name. Money was so tight that he even tried to get a job with British Rail just for the free uniform. The idea of owning decent clothes was motivation enough, but he failed the physical exam and didn't get the job. The one silver lining was that going through the application process qualified him for unemployment benefits. How Ringo completed the Beatles' formula. Ringo Starr's journey into music didn't begin with a polished drum kit or a formal lesson. Instead, it started with skiffle, a homemade, do-it-yourself style of music that was wildly popular across Britain. One of his co-workers introduced him to it, showing him how everyday objects could become instruments. For a kid who grew up with almost nothing, skiffle was perfect, cheap, creative, and full of energy. By the time he reached 17, he finally got his hands on a real drum set. And from that moment on, music became the path he wanted to follow. That passion carried him far, almost all the way to Texas. When he was around 18 or 19, he became obsessed with the American blues coming out of the Lone Star State, especially the sound of Houston legend Lightnin' Hopkins. He loved it so much he tried to emigrate to the United States just so he could live next door to Hopkins and work in local factories. He even visited the American consulate and filled out all the paperwork. But when they handed him even more forms, his patience ran out. He abandoned the idea, a decision that unknowingly kept the future Beatles lineup intact. Back in Liverpool, he was still known as Ringo Starr. That changed in 1957 when he joined Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, one of the most popular bands in the city at the time. The group performed energetic shows, toured in France and Germany, and for a while, they were even more successful than the Beatles. It was during this period that Ringo became Ringo Starr. The name came from his love for Western movies and from the character names he admired, men called Ringo, who rode horses across dusty plains. And, of course, it helped that he loved wearing rings. Starkey became Starr for showbiz flair, and the new name stuck. During a 1960 tour in Hamburg, Ringo crossed paths for the first time with an ambitious but still developing group made up of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and their bassist friend Stuart Sutcliffe, with Pete Best on drums. These young musicians were grinding through grueling sets in Germany and back home in Liverpool, slowly building a loyal following. When Brian Epstein became their manager, he guided them toward a deal with EMI's Parlophone label. Producer George Martin liked their sound but wasn't convinced about their drummer. The band agreed, and when it came time to choose someone stronger, they turned to Ringo Starr. What's striking is that when Ringo first connected with the Beatles, he was actually more successful than they were. The Hurricanes were often billed above the Beatles on posters, and Ringo earned more money than the band that would one day conquer the world. They were in such high demand across Liverpool that they even turned down multiple Hamburg gigs that the Beatles desperately depended on. Still, fame has its risks. When the Beatles finally made the switch, replacing Pete Best with Ringo, the reaction back home was explosive. By August 19, 1962, the night of Ringo's first official performance with the Beatles at the Cavern Club, the audience was furious. That show, number 217 for the band at that venue, was filled with angry shouts from loyal Pete Best supporters. Some fans promised never to return. Others yelled for Ringo to get off the stage. Even local musicians admitted that part of the hostility came from Ringo's background. To them, he'd jumped from a band people didn't take seriously into the biggest act on Merseyside. But history tells the rest. Ringo's arrival didn't slow the Beatles down. It completed them. With him behind the kit, they recorded their breakthrough debut album, Please Please Me, in 1963 and every album that followed. Their singles shot straight to the top of the charts. That same year, they performed for British royalty at the Prince of Wales Theatre and watched songs like From Me to You and She Loves You explode across the country. Ringo's fear of losing his spot. In 1964, Beatlemania didn't just show up. It erupted like nothing the music world had ever seen. It started in January, when I Want to Hold Your Hand blasted past 1 million sales and shot straight to #1 on the Billboard charts. But the moment that truly changed everything came a few weeks later, on February 9th, when the Beatles stepped onto the stage of The Ed Sullivan Show for the very first time. An unbelievable 73 million people tuned in. That was more than 40% of the entire U.S. population watching 4 young men from Liverpool make their American debut. It was the kind of cultural moment that instantly rewrote the rules. Then came April, and that first week practically felt like a magic trick. According to the Beatles' Bible, the band pulled off a chart domination so wild it still sounds unreal. They held all 5 top spots on the Billboard Hot 100. #1 was Can't Buy Me Love, followed by Twist and Shout, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Please, Please Me. And that wasn't even the full picture. They had 7 more songs on the chart that same week, giving them a jaw-dropping total of 12. By this point, Beatlemania had turned into a global tidal wave. The band launched into a world tour looking unstoppable, until everything suddenly wasn't. On June 3, 1964, during a photo shoot in London for the Saturday Evening Post, Ringo Starr collapsed. He was rushed to University College Hospital, where doctors diagnosed tonsillitis and pharyngitis and ordered immediate rest. The problem was, the world tour was scheduled to begin the very next day. Flights were booked, venues were sold out, and fans everywhere were vibrating with excitement. Canceling wasn't just a bad idea, it would have been catastrophic. The remaining Beatles were heartbroken at the idea of replacing Ringo, and George Harrison was the toughest to convince. Their manager, Brian Epstein, and producer George Martin had to work overtime persuading him that backing out now would let everyone down. Only once George finally agreed did Epstein bring up a name he had in mind, a talented 24-year-old drummer he'd recently watched in the studio, Jimmy Nicol. Paul McCartney knew Nicol too, having seen him tear up the stage with Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. Everything moved at lightning speed. Nicol auditioned by playing 6 songs, nailed every one of them, and was hired on the spot. The band even gave him the classic Beatles haircut to complete the transformation. Meanwhile, Ringo lay in a hospital bed, feeling something he never expected: fear of being replaced. After all, he had once taken over for Pete Best. The thought of history repeating itself hit him hard. But unlike Pete's situation, this absence was temporary, and the band made sure he knew it. Jimmy Nicol spent just 13 whirlwind days touring with John, Paul, and George. He stayed quiet during press conferences while reporters zeroed in on the main trio. But outside those moments, he got swept up in something he had never experienced: hordes of young women who suddenly couldn't get enough of him. One day, he was a working musician few people noticed. The next, he was riding in limousines with Lennon and McCartney as fans screamed just to touch him. And then, just as fast as it arrived, the fame disappeared the moment Ringo returned. Paul McCartney later reflected that it wasn't an easy role for Nicol to step into, especially knowing it would all vanish once his brief tenure ended. And he was right. But Ringo's homecoming was something special. When he rejoined the band in Australia, massive crowds greeted him with confetti, cheers, and relief. George Martin would later say Nicole had done an excellent job, and then faded instantly into obscurity. A year later, in 1965, the madness of Beatlemania had only intensified. During their North American tour, the band made a stop in Toronto and then flew to Montreal for 2 shows at the Forum. Things turned serious the moment their plane touched down at Dorval Airport. A heavy security force was waiting, including 120 members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Their main focus was protecting Ringo. Montreal, as the largest city in Quebec, sat at the center of French-Canadian separatist movements, some of which carried violent and extremist views. Before the band even arrived, one such group had issued death threats specifically aimed at Ringo, mistakenly targeting him for being English and Jewish, something he wasn't. Threats were nothing new to the band, but this time, even he admitted feeling genuinely afraid. Security stayed tight but discreet during the concerts. A plainclothes officer sat close to Ringo throughout both the 4 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. shows, while police snipers were positioned around the venue. Ringo even angled his cymbals toward the audience as a small shield, something he rarely did. Thankfully, no attack ever came. The shows finished without incident, and once the final applause faded, the band was quickly escorted out of Montreal, leaving behind a story that became one of the most intense and unsettling moments of their touring years. Ringo's secret struggle in the band. Looking back over the long, twisting history of the Beatles, there's an unmistakable pattern that keeps showing up. Ringo Starr was often treated like the odd one out. It started early and hit hard. He ended up singing lead on only 11 Beatles tracks. And out of the band's entire catalog, just 2 songs were written entirely by him. And even in those early breakthrough years, he was sidelined in a way that felt painfully obvious. Take one of their earliest hits, Love Me Do. When producer George Martin heard Ringo's drumming on the track, he wasn't impressed. Instead of giving Ringo another shot, Martin brought in session drummer Andy White to handle the drums on both Love Me Do and its B-side, P.S. I Love You. That left Ringo stuck playing tambourine on one track and maracas on the other. For a brand new Beatle, that had to sting. By the late 1960s, the tension inside the band had reached legendary levels. Arguments were constant, the atmosphere was creatively suffocating, and Ringo found himself drowning in self-doubt. He rarely got drum solos, and the pressure of being part of the world's most famous band was crushing. Even worse, he convinced himself he was the cause of the group's rising friction. In the anthology, he later admitted he felt like an outsider, convinced the others were closer to each other than to him. That fear and frustration finally boiled over in 1968. Ringo walked out in the middle of the White Album sessions, feeling exhausted and unwanted. He visited John Lennon first, telling him he wasn't playing well and felt unloved. And to his surprise, John confessed he had thought the other 3 were the close-knit ones. Ringo then went to Paul, said the same thing, and got the same response. Each one believed the others were shutting them out, a striking sign of how fractured the band had become. The breaking point came during the recording of Back in the USSR. According to multiple sources, the tension was so thick that Ringo simply left the studio and flew to Sardinia with his family to find some peace. Part of his frustration came from Paul repeatedly giving him notes on a tom-tom part, which only added fuel to the fire. While he was gone, the others kept recording, pulling in bits of Ringo's earlier drumming, and having Paul lay down new drum parts himself. But that brief getaway had a silver lining. While relaxing on a yacht, Ringo wrote Octopus's Garden, one of his most beloved Beatles songs. Around the same time, his bandmates sent him a warm telegram telling him how much they loved him and urging him to come back. When he finally returned to the studio 2 weeks later, George Harrison had decorated his entire drum kit with flowers to welcome him home. As the 1970s approached, the cracks in the band were impossible to ignore. In March of that year, Ringo appeared on BBC Radio 2 and confidently said the group would reunite once their solo projects were done. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart at high speed. Apple Records was preparing to release Let It Be, the band's 12th and final album, but the date clashed with Paul McCartney's upcoming solo record. John and George decided Paul's album needed to be delayed, and they sent Ringo to deliver the news. That visit exploded instantly. Paul later said it was the only time he ever shouted at someone to leave his house. Ringo testified in court the following year that Paul had shouted at him, jabbed a finger toward his face, and threatened him during the confrontation. The tension was raw, personal, and undeniable. In the end, Paul's album, McCartney, came out on April 17th, while Let It Be was pushed back. A few weeks later, Paul publicly announced he was stepping away from the Beatles. What sounded temporary became permanent, and the band formally dissolved. For fans, it marked the end of a 6-year run, where the Beatles dominated global music in a way no one has matched since. For the group itself, especially John and Paul, it was the collapse of one of history's greatest songwriting partnerships, followed by a stretch defined by emotional distance and even musical jabs aimed at each other. But among the four, the one who struggled the most with the breakup wasn't the one who walked away first, or the one already deep into solo projects. It was Ringo Starr. Despite all the doubts, the misunderstandings, the moments he felt overlooked, he had loved being part of the Beatles more deeply than he ever let on. And when it all truly ended, he felt that loss more sharply than anyone else. Why Ringo's critics were all wrong. Back in August 1962, when Ringo Starr officially replaced Pete Best as the Beatles' drummer, he wasn't stepping into unfamiliar territory. Far from it. Ringo came from Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, one of the most popular groups in Liverpool's beat scene. The Beatles already knew him well, and the two bands had built a tight bond during those intense, formative nights playing in Hamburg in the early 60s. Ringo later reflected on that connection during an appearance on the Q interview with Tom Power, describing just how natural the friendship between both bands felt. A little further into that same interview, he opened up about the deep musical chemistry he eventually found with the Beatles. He spoke especially about his connection with John Lennon, explaining how they seemed to move in sync instinctively, both live and in the studio. Ringo described moments where he could play with his eyes closed and still anticipate exactly where John was heading, adjusting the beat to fit his direction and pulling everything back together when the band drifted into chaotic territory. For any drummer, being seen as the anchor of a group is a major compliment, and coming from someone like John Lennon, it spoke volumes. That brings things to one of the biggest Beatles myths, the claim that John supposedly didn't like Ringo's drumming. The rumor hinges on a line that's been repeated endlessly, the joke about Ringo not even being the best drummer in the Beatles. It's sharp, funny, and unforgettable. But it never came from John Lennon. It didn't come from any Beatle at all. The famous punchline actually originated on a BBC radio comedy show called Radioactive and aired on October 6, 1981. Written by Jeffrey Perkins and delivered by Philip Pope, the joke was broadcast nearly a year after Lennon's death. For decades, comedian Jasper Carrott was incorrectly credited with saying it, but Beatles historian Mark Lewisohn eventually uncovered the real origin. So John Lennon had absolutely nothing to do with the line, and wasn't even alive when it first hit the airwaves. Now, John did speak openly about Ringo, during what would become his final appearance on television, on The Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder. But his comments were honest, supportive, and rooted in admiration. John explained that out of all his former bandmates, he was most proud of Ringo's success as a solo artist. He admitted that Ringo didn't have the same songwriting background as the others during their Beatles years, but he never framed that as a flaw. Instead, he pushed back against the old jokes implying Ringo lacked intelligence, calling that idea nonsense. He pointed out that Ringo simply wasn't known for writing his own material while they were together. John also acknowledged the uncertainty people once had about Ringo's post-Beatles future. They knew he could act, he'd already proven that, but no one was sure how his solo recording career would unfold. With a wry sense of humor, John admitted that in some ways, Ringo's solo work had turned out better than his own. So when the myth is stripped away, the reality becomes much clearer. John Lennon never dismissed Ringo's drumming, never joked about replacing him, and never questioned his talent. If anything, he admired the way Ringo grew after the band ended. And long before any of that, Ringo had already proven himself, not just as a drummer, but as a friend who was part of the Beatles' world well before he ever joined the lineup. Ringo Starr refused to attend his funeral. Now we finally know why. Neil Stanley. Aspinall's story begins long before the spotlight ever found the Beatles. He wasn't just a music executive, he was one of the boys. A school friend of Paul McCartney and George Harrison, he was right there at the start, in the ordinary, everyday moments that came before the chaos of fame. In a way, he slipped into history simply by being in the right place at the right time. When the Beatles started catching fire, they brought Neil along for the ride. His first job was as their road manager, and it was anything but glamorous. Picture him behind the wheel of his old Commer van, hauling the band and their equipment from gig to gig, often through the night. It was a gritty job, but he never backed down. When Mal Evans later joined the team, Neil moved up to become the group's personal assistant, a role that placed him closer to the heart of the operation. As the years rolled on, Neil's responsibilities only grew. He eventually rose to become the chief executive of Apple Corps, the band's own company. In that position, he was no longer just the friend who drove the van. He became a major force behind the scenes, managing lawsuits that pitted Apple Corps against big names like Alan Klein, EMI, and Apple Computer. Beyond the courtroom, he oversaw the entire marketing universe of the Beatles: music, videos, merchandise, everything that carried their name. He also served as a director of standby films, running the company straight from his home in Twickenham. After decades of protecting the band's legacy, Neil stepped down from Apple Corps on April 10, 2007. A year later, he passed away at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York after a battle with lung cancer. His death marked the end of a remarkable journey. Friend, assistant, executive, guardian of the Beatles' empire. His funeral reflected just how deeply he was respected. Around 250 mourners gathered at the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Twickenham, a blend of family, friends, and music legends. Yoko Ono attended, along with members of The Who and the band's longtime producer, George Martin. Beatles family members were there too, Stella McCartney and Barbara Bach among them. Even Pete Best, the group's original drummer, came to pay his respects. The service ended on a touching and beautifully personal note. Pete Townshend picked up his guitar and played Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man before moving into George Harrison's My Sweet Lord. It was a quiet, emotional goodbye that spoke louder than any speech. But one question always hangs around the story of that day. Why didn't Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr attend the funeral? Speculation runs wild. Some say it was because Pete Best would be there. Others try to attach drama that simply wasn't there. The truth is only known to Paul and Ringo. What is known is much more important. Both men visited Neil in his final days, a gesture that says far more about their loyalty and affection than any public appearance could. Paul McCartney even covered Neil's medical bills without fanfare. The idea that Pete Best factored into their absence doesn't hold much weight. Ringo and Pete had never been bandmates or friends. Paul and Pete had been friendly once, sure, but not deeply close. And the decision to let Pete go back in the early days wasn't made by the band. It was made by their manager, like any workplace decision handled by leadership, not by co-workers. Fans often romanticize the story, painting Pete as the tragic figure. But even Pete had publicly claimed he was fired because John and Paul were jealous of him. The narrative has never been as simple as some want it to be. More likely, Paul and Ringo stayed away for a different reason. They didn't want to turn Neil's funeral into a media circus. Their presence would have shifted all attention, from Neil, from his family, from the people who loved him, to cameras, headlines, and celebrity frenzy. Out of respect, they chose silence over spectacle. And they've never carried guilt about the drummer change that shaped Beatles history. Paul has never been tormented by the decision. It was the right move for the band's chemistry and musical future. Ringo never felt guilty stepping into the role either. He had already played with them several times and was a natural fit. He wasn't a stranger replacing someone. He was a friend joining his friends. If anything, their absence from the funeral shows something important about who they are. They understood that real respect doesn't always come with the spotlight. Sometimes, the truest gesture is stepping back, making space, and letting the moment belong to the person who earned it.